It's great to be here. It's a little unnerving for me. I've never really done a journalistic interview on a band. On the bandstand, yeah.
You're now an opening act.
EJ suggested that maybe we would sing the whole panel tonight, and I'm sure that the audience would love that. As Chris mentioned, we have a great subject tonight. Where does President Obama go from here? Somewhat into his second term in office, and it looks like he has a tough road ahead of him on everything, even something like today's passage of immigration through the Senate should be an easy next step, but we all know that it's not going to be for him. On the other hand, his health care plan is about to go into effect. The economy, even if it's not getting a lot better, is getting better incrementally. And his ratings, again, by the public, if they're not going up, they seem to at least be level. They're not going down. So in this day and age, that's good news. To talk about all of these things, we do have a panel of great journalists. Ron Brownstein, who directs political coverage for all of the Atlantic media and also writes a widely read political column and is considered one of the most knowledgeable political journalists in Washington. E.J. Dionne also writes an influential column, which appears in the Washington Post and other newspapers, and he's a senior fellow at Brookings Institution and also a professor at Georgetown University. I don't know how you have time to do all of that.
I have 3 kids and 3 jobs.
I see, one for each, good. And he brought his beautiful daughter here with him.
Are you out there, Joel? I want to make sure you got in.
Chrystia Freeland is a specialist in economics, but she also runs all of the consumer digital platforms for Thomson-Reuters. And for me, that is something that puts her kind of in the forefront of where all of us know that we are heading, but she's kind of a pioneer for journalists who are trying to figure out how exactly the new media is going to affect them, and also, more importantly, their coverage. Andrew Revkin is also somebody who works now in new media to the extent that he writes a blog. He has covered science and the environment for some 30 years, but he now writes the .Earth blog for the New York Times. He's also written a number of books on climate issues, and he's a senior fellow for environmental understanding, of which there should be probably a lot more, at Pace University. So welcome. We're going to do this one kind of like we do a television talk show. No set speeches. I'm going to ask everybody to try to keep their remarks limited. And so here we go. So Ron, in Tuesday's Washington Post, columnist Chrystia, who writes The Fix, asked the question about whether or not the presidential bully pulpit is actually dead, was the phrase that was used in the headline. What with the IRS, Benghazi, the collection of phone records of AP reporters, the Edward Snowden affair, the NSA snooping, not to mention the failure of gun control. You wrote in February that the president had a suddenly aggressive second-term agenda. And I wondered if things have changed, or you still think that the president is in, as you put it, on a confident and confrontational course.
I mean, the basic reality we're living in is that we are in the highest level of party line voting since the turn of the 20th century. We are in a quasi-parliamentary system without majority rule because of the Senate filibuster. And the question of whether the bully pulpit is dead is not really unique to Obama in any way. The question is really whether it is possible for a Democratic president to exert leverage on Republicans, or really vice versa anymore. Virtually every House Republican, all but 15, were elected by districts that voted for Mitt Romney. Virtually every House Democrat were elected by districts that voted for Obama. You're seeing states sort by the way they vote presidentially. There's more of a clear line of direction from voters. Almost all Republicans were sent to Washington by voters who also voted against Obama. Almost all Democrats were sent to Washington by voters who also voted for him. So you're seeing high levels of party unity, and I think that gives the president very little leverage. on the other party, which makes it hard to get things done unless they see it in their interest. And immigration is the one where it still could tip on that side of the line, but it's not guaranteed.
And I'm going to ask Chrystia about that in a minute, but I'm just going to ask EJ, from your point of view, have these controversies, like the IRS, the NSA, Benghazi, do you think that they have served to undermine what the president is going to be able to accomplish, or are these just distractions that Republicans want to talk about and things that the public doesn't really care about, and the president can just keep doing whatever he's doing?
Well, I think that Benghazi has largely gone away. I don't think there's much there, and they haven't been willing to investigate what really matters, which is why was our ambassador there, and how did the thing itself happen? And I don't think they will go into that. So I think Benghazi is not a problem. I think the IRS is much less of a problem. It's a political problem because it'll mobilize Tea Party voters next year. I don't think it's a big story at the moment. It's still going to flurry around a little bit. You saw it a bit in the news today. I think the NSA is a bigger problem because it cuts people off Obama who are in his own base. I mean, if there's one good thing about the NSA story is that we're not divided on party lines about this. Both parties are divided. The more libertarian Republicans are siding with the ACLU Democrats on this. And so that's potentially a problem. But I don't think it necessarily, I don't think any of these stories matter. In her first campaign, Hillary Clinton, did I say her first campaign? In her first presidential campaign, Hillary Clinton used to talk about her husband's record and say, peace and prosperity, what part of that don't you like? And I still think that the way people are going to judge the president is primarily about, does the recovery continue and speed up? And what is our position in the world? And there, I think things are a little shaky because he may not want to engage in the Middle East, but the Middle East wants to engage him.
And I want to talk about that too, but before we move too far away from the NSA, I want to ask Andrew, for a lot of people, we have heard for so long that the U.S. is somewhat incompetent on the technology front, that we aren't using technology to try to track terrorists, that we aren't using technology in a way that would help us maybe spy on the Chinese in the way that they're spying on us. So along come these revelations. In a way, isn't that a vote of confidence in the administration's competence on this level?
Well, yeah, there's this issue with, basically what you're seeing here also in the background, one of the meta story here is this new capacity for not just governments or agencies to deal with these data on this level, but Google, anyone read The Filter Bubble? Essentially, we're all living in a world where when you Google for something and I Google for something, we get different results because the system is learning what we want. So we're all in the early days on this question, and the agencies, for them to be jumping ahead is totally expected. And I would be, personally, as a taxpayer and a citizen of a country, I would be bummed if they weren't exploiting every possible way to find a way to get and kill bad guys using these technologies. And then you end up in this, liberty versus security debate that we've been in for, as long as there's been government in.
Since you work in a medium that is somewhat interactive and you're hearing more from the public, are you hearing that people are really angry about this issue? Or are you hearing from those who engage with the different platforms that you're on, that people just think, okay, this is what we ought to be doing after all?
I'm actually with EJ on this one. I think the interesting thing about this is it's really raised public consciousness about how much people know about us. And I do think that people have a different feeling when it's the government watching you versus an advertiser watching you. So I think, as consumers, we're prepared to do a deal with Google and get free email and terrific search in exchange for being served ads that are tailored to the stuff we're looking at. And by the way, that's really happening. It's not so much the search results that are different, it's the ads that are different. That's where the money is. But I think it has actually been a real awakening for a lot of people to say, wait a minute, the government is watching me. I think it's actually a big issue, and I think it's actually really important because I think as a society, and not just America, but really the world, we haven't really stepped back and said, okay, this is a new frontier, and what do we want in this frontier? The trade-off between security
just
and
one-
privacy.
And do
to
you
be.
think this is, I'm sorry, do you think this is something that works, again, talking about the presidential agenda, which we're here to do, does this work to the president's benefit, or is it detrimental to him that this is being done on his
Well, this is the
watch?
point I was going to get at. It's hard, you can't stand up there and give a speech and prove the negative. They've tried to do that by listing, we think we've avoided X number of terrorist incidents, but that doesn't really have salience for most people. So politically, it's hard to find the way to find the win. I don't know.
On the other hand, his fiercest critics are not going to complain about this one. So it's this perverse thing where it's his partisans who are the most outraged,
So-
and his critics who can't really complain about it.
I disagree a little on both sides, actually. We just finished, we do this quarterly poll called the Hotline Monitor, and through great fortuitousness, it was on privacy this time, right as it was coming out. And two things I believe are true. I think people are actually a little more unnerved by the private collection of data on them than, and by and large, people believe that just about everything they want to keep secret, someone has access to, like 80%. And the other side is, I do think on balance,
And they're right.
yeah, right, that's right. And on balance, I think in the trade-off between security and privacy, I think security always wins. I think for every president correctly concludes there is greater downside risk in not doing enough to prevent a terrorist attack than doing too much and being seen as infringing civil liberties.
We could do a whole panel on this, so I'm just going to move on to immigration for a second, and I want to ask, since they're both sitting side by side, both EJ and Chrystia, I mean, we are in a normal situation where you didn't have the kind of Congress we have now. You would be looking for some kind of compromise that's going to go forward now that the Senate has passed this bill. But what we're hearing is dead on arrival. It's not going to happen. What do you both think about that?
Yeah, I don't believe that yet, this dead on arrival business. First of all, the bill that passed the Senate already is a substantial compromise, which is why it got 68 votes today, including 14 Republicans, which I still think is a very big deal. And I think the Republicans are actually very torn on this, because if you think of three major Republican constituencies, two of them are on the side of immigration reform. One is business, and last I heard, Republicans are fairly responsive to business interests. And business is overwhelmingly for this. The question is, how much muscle are they going to put in it? A second group that's for this are conservative, a lot of conservative evangelical preachers. So religious people across the board are for this, in part for good biblical reasons about welcoming the stranger, but in part because Latinos are folks that Catholics and the evangelicals and the Mormons are all very interested in. They don't want to alienate them. And so what you have, and then the third group are the sort of nativist wing of the Tea Party, which is really against this, really loud, and has a major role to play in Republican primaries. What I think really matters is not how many Republicans in the House end up voting for it. It's whether a majority of Republicans in the House think that it should pass. And the question will be, do these Republicans go to Boehner and say, some of them will say, we may have to vote against this, but we think you should go forward. And I think that's possible.
Chrystia, you're shaking your head. You agree with that?
Yeah, no, and so for full disclosure, I should admit here, I'm not an American, I'm Canadian. I'm here on a green card, though, fully legal. And so I agree with everything EJ has said, and the only point that I would add on the Republican side is there's also the fact of 2012. And I think there is this very powerful political logic which is driving the Republicans too, which is we cannot afford to continue to alienate this growing population in our country. And so for those reasons, I actually see immigration as the one place, as Ron hinted, where this increasing partisanship can be sort of circled around because there's a mutual interest.
Let me ask Ron this, who watches Congress so carefully. Is there, on some levels, since many in the White House have called this, said this will be the crowning, if immigration's passed, this will be the crowning achievement of the Obama administration. Is there a certain sense among congressional Republicans, well, maybe we don't want to have this great
Right.
victory for
And,
him.
and look, and immigration crystallizes the broader problem facing Republicans, who are now in the situation that Democrats were in the 70s and 80s when they controlled the House reliably but could not win the White House. What works for the congressional party does not always work for the national party, and in many cases can be inimical to what they need to do nationally. I mean, the dominant reality in the House is they've drawn themselves districts that have almost completely segregated themselves, and I use that word advisedly, from the demographic changes that are making it so hard to win the White House. 80% of the House Republicans are in districts that are more white than the national average. On the other hand, Mitt Romney won a higher share of white voters in 2012 than Ronald Reagan did in 1980. And Barack Obama won 332 electoral college votes. So the party clearly has like an existential need to improve its performance among minorities at the presidential level, which is why you have people like Karl Rove and Ed Gillespie and Haley Barbour and Jeb Bush saying do this. The individual members looking back at their predominantly white, conservative, blue-collar, in many cases, districts say, what's in it for me? What's in it for them is, do you ever want to have a chance of working with a Republican president again? I just close by saying EJ's got it exactly right. There's really only one question left on this. Will John Boehner violate the Hastert rule? The Hastert rule says that they will not bring a bill to the floor unless it gets not only a majority overall, but a majority of the majority. Those Venn diagrams do not overlap. There is no bill that a majority of House Republicans could vote for that President Obama could sign. So Boehner has to make the call. Is he and will he get the wink and the nod from the conservatives who, as EJ says, okay, I don't want to vote for it, but go ahead and pass it mostly with Democratic votes. Let's get this behind us.
Since all of this is, again, we're looking toward what the president can do here, I guess there's a big question. I'd like all of you to respond to this because I think it's really the big question about what happens going forward, and that is how much of the gridlock in Congress, whether it's on immigration or gun control, how much of it is the president's fault? I mean, you hear over and over again from people in Washington that he doesn't really exercise the bully pulpit enough, that he doesn't try to build coalitions. I asked this question, by the way, to two people who had worked in various administrations last night. One a Republican, one a Democrat. The Democrat said it was 75% the president's fault. The Republicans said 60%. Pretty high number. So Andrew, let me start with you. I mean, do you, from looking at this and the issues that you cover, do you see a president who isn't engaged enough with Congress and isn't trying to build coalitions?
Well, that's different than the bully pulpit question. I mean, the bully pulpit question is what I hear and what I wrote a few times was, where's the president who's going to do what JFK did on going to the moon on our energy frontiers? Because even with shale gas, even with this boom we have now, for the long haul, you need new options to come in beyond the gas. And it's clear to me, it's been clear to me for a while that Obama is not a leader. He's a leader in the 21st century sense, which is you do what you think the people want you to do, which is not the definition of a leader. Of course, Kennedy had the space race, had the Cold War to drive his push on getting to the moon. And there is, as long as there isn't a crisis of that sort where to make an issue salience is the word. All the sociologists study this politics stuff tell me if you don't have salience, and you don't have that with global warming, you don't have that with energy either, and you don't have that with NSA. Salience is, are you going to go to the voting booth next year and vote on this issue? I don't think it's there. So he's never shown evidence that he's going to step out ahead of that.
I want to come back to some of those issues in a minute, but E.G., I know you have some firm thoughts on this. To your mind, is there anything the president can do with this Congress, and should he be reaching out more?
I think two things are true at the same time, and they seem to be in contradiction. On the one hand, I always like to say that if you could give Obama a sort of Clinton empathy schmooze injection, and if you could give Bill Clinton an Obama cool discipline injection, you'd have two near-perfect politicians. But it doesn't work that way. And that the fact is Obama doesn't like to engage as much as he should. I think he hasn't used the White House as much. I think he should bring more people in and all of that. Having said that, I'm not sure it would make any difference in the current environment. And that I think the Republican Party has moved far to the right of where it used to be. Conservatism has moved far to the right of where it used to be. And that there is a real determination within the Republican base and following the base, a lot of its leaders, to try to stop Obama. Now, there are some issues where they can cross. Immigration is one. But for the most part, I just think that there isn't a whole lot he can do, and a lot of it is on the Republicans to decide what issues do they want to work with him on.
And you don't think that there are enough moderate Republicans in Congress that he could try to reach out to bring them along?
I think there are almost no moderate Republicans left, and there aren't enough moderate conservative Republicans to pull. I mean, but I'm serious. I'm not making a partisan point.
I should have said moderate conservative.
Yeah, because, no, but I mean, there were so many great moderate, even moderate to liberal Republicans, people like, Chris Shays of Connecticut, who was around here, or Jim Leach, or Jacob Javits, or Mac Mathias. I mean, there was a long list of genuinely moderate to progressive Republicans. None of those guys or women are there anymore.
So from your point of view, Chrystia, are we just doomed to have an administration that is just a victim of gridlock? I mean, would you agree with that?
Depressing as it is to say, yes, I do. I mean, I think that there are two big issues here. I think EJ is absolutely right. Obama doesn't schmooze, and that's a bad thing in a president. Having said that, I think there are bigger structural factors at play. And one of them is that the Republican Party hasn't figured out, in a way, what its post-Reagan position is going to be and what its kind of 21st century age of a very multi-ethnic America, and frankly, age of a hollowing out middle class America, what the Republican position is going to be. So that is a real issue. And the electoral map, as Ron pointed out, is actually hardening that. So it's not, just about, I think sometimes, in the pundit class, there can be this temptation to say, if only these politicians would behave differently and would be better people. They're not morons, They are responding to the real electoral realities in the places where they need actual humans to elect them. And the fact that Americans are, and I think Ron's word was exactly right, self-segregating is part of what is driving this segregation of the politics.
Then should the president be still trying to go forward with things like not just immigration, but say gun control, where, some people said, well, this is a guy who just put this out there and he thought he was the president, and people would go for it, and he wanted to get on the record as saying that the Republicans weren't going to go along with him as part of his strategy.
So a couple of thoughts. I think EJ and Chrystia are both exactly right. He should be doing more, and it probably would not make much difference because it is structural forces. As I said before, the electorate has sorted in a way that there are very few cross-pressured members in either chamber anymore. Almost all of the Republicans are from states and districts that don't like Obama, and they feel that they are voting in the interest of that district by opposing him. It is very hard to go forward legislatively except where they see it in their interest. And I believe he has reached that. If we're talking about where Obama goes from here, I think he has essentially reached that conclusion. I think apart from immigration, which they still believe might come together, they are looking mostly for ways to move unilaterally through executive action. And certainly the speech on climate change this week was a big example of that. He is spending an incredible amount of personal time on the implementation of the health care bill. And I think they view, there's a limited ability to move. Like I said, I think that the decisions from the Republicans have to come from the inside out. Because if you go back and you think, on the gun control, there was an extraordinary negotiation between Joe Manchin, the most conservative Democrat, and Pat Toomey, brought along almost no one. The bill the immigration bill that passed today included this Corker initiative, Corker and who is the initiative that will double the border patrol, something that will probably never happen and would be kind of crazy if it did. Even in 2009, he let Max Baucus spend 3 months negotiating with Charles Grassley, trying to find a version of the health care bill that Republicans would support. The internal politics of the parties now make it very hard for them to come together. So I think they have decided mostly they're going to go forward alone. But very quickly, last point, I think you implied in your question, what's different is they feel that by raising these issues, they are reinforcing their long-term electoral advantage. For Republicans to block immigration reform in the House is not a cost-free action. For Republicans to block the universal background checks at a time when Democrats have realigned all of these suburban white-collar counties is not a cost-free action. Marco Rubio voting against universal background checks, I guarantee you, if you get Denver TV out here, and he is the nominee, you will see that on Denver TV in 20, and that's different than in the past, Rita. In the past, the Democrats have not felt these wedge issues works for them, so I think he feels it's kind of a no-lose proposition.
On the other hand, and it's interesting, we've been talking about things like immigration. We've been talking about gun control. We haven't really been talking about bread and butter issues, and you wrote a piece not so long ago where you talked about the fact that what the public really cares about is jobs, economy, education, all those things. So in a way, is he squandering what's left of his administration by focusing on these sort of wedge issues?
It's a great question, and Chrystia, I think, would have a lot to say. I think they have concluded that it is very difficult to do anything with Congress on the economy, that the chances of getting a grand bargain are greatly diminished from what they were in December, and certainly in 2012, much of their electoral strategy was reinforcing their coalition through individual slivers.
So let's talk about what.
Could I just say something on that?
Sure.
I think it's really important that Obama lay out a fuller agenda on what we should do about inequality and declining social mobility. And he's got pieces of it. The pre-K, universal pre-K is part of it. Some educational pieces are part of it. But I think he should be very aggressive and say, this may or may not get through this Congress, but if we really care about people rising again, and if we really care about how unequal we become, we ought to take these steps. And I hope he uses some of his time in the next couple of years to do that.
This gets back to the leadership issue, Andrew, that you raised earlier. And so I wonder, since climate is really one of your specialties, do you think that the announcements that the president had made in the past couple of weeks with the big climate speech, the CO2 regulations that he says he's going to push forward, are these things really things that he's just saying and it could possibly be changed by whoever the next president is? I mean, how serious is he about these things?
Well, the most dramatic things, putting controls on CO2, carbon dioxide from power plants, existing power plants, that's the biggest lift. But anyone who knows that issue knows that it'll be literally 10 or 20, EPA officials tell me 20 years to go through all the process it would take for that to actually come to the fore and fundamentally change how we generate power. There's some things that could be worked out before then. So he's kind of, if you take that to the side, there's actually, within what he said about adapting to climate change, there's some opportunities to build consensus with libertarians, because we subsidize in ways that are ridiculous, people living in harm's way. I know plenty of libertarians who hate subsidies or subsidized flood insurance. Here in Colorado, all those houses that have been built in the red zone, where we know there will be fires with or without climate change, many of them have a deduction on their second mortgage to build that house. I'm sorry if any of you do. Why should I, as a taxpayer somewhere else, be paying?
The stage will be stormed.
Be paying for the deductibility of a mortgage of someone building a house where it's going to get burned down. And there's Headwaters Economics has done, which is kind of a conservative economics analysis place here, has done work that says that's a good idea. And he seems to, from the language and what he said, he seems to like that kind of thing.
But for the president to make an announcement like this, isn't this in a way an assertion of the executive power, and in a way his saying, look, I want people to know that I can't get anything through Congress?
For 3 years, his base has been demanding this, beseeching him to do this. I wrote a piece 3 years ago when John Holdren, the science advisor, said in a Washington meeting, the president is going to give a major speech on global warming, as if it was going to happen that year, and it didn't, and it didn't, and it didn't, and it didn't.
Ron, you said in your column today that for institutional, economic, and political reasons, the president has more leverage than he had on this issue than he did in the first term when he tried and failed to get Congress to impose carbon emission limits. Why do you think he has that leverage?
Well, I think a lot has changed since 2009. I think in 2009 he was looking for a legislative solution, so he had to get enough votes to pass it. Now, and of course he could not. They passed the House and then were blocked by the filibuster in the Senate. It was unclear whether they had a majority. They might have had a slim majority, but they certainly didn't have 60 votes. Well, the institutional possession arrow is reversed here. He now is acting through regulatory action, and the opponents will have to get enough votes to stop it. Now, there's something called the Congressional Review Act that both chambers can pass legislation to block this, but a resolution to block it, but he can veto that, and it is unlikely they will get to that. So the EPA regulation process will be able to go through it. As Andrew says, it's a very long process. The other thing, the two other things that are different, though, is that, and that's why I'd be interested in your thought on this, the potential is for this market, for this regulation to reinforce the direction the market is already going. In 2008, when he took office, coal provided half of all electricity, natural gas only 20%. The natural gas boom has really changed that dynamic. A lot more utilities have been switching to natural gas. So the idea of moving away from coal, I think, from my conversations, is less frightening to utility executives.
Unless you're a coal miner.
Well, but even a coal miner, no, right? But for the utilities. And also even for the energy companies, the politics are different. I mean, the idea in 2009, I think, was that if we moved sharply against coal, we're going to have to make this generational leap to solar and wind. I think now, as the president described it, used the word transition fuel. People see a kind of a halfway point that is easier for them to imagine, that is comparable in cost, a little more expensive still, but not vastly more so, and which also, incidentally, has its own political constituency.
Right, no, but the key point there is
the
the key point, which is the big change in the whole energy and environment equation, is what's happened with new fossil fuels coming online.
Right.
And that is totally connected to EJ's point about the middle class. And that's why this is an issue which there is both opportunity but a balancing act that this president has to do. When people talk about the U.S. economy being relatively strong in the world, which it is, it may, looking at it inside the U.S., you may feel like it's slow, it's weak. Go anywhere else in the world, and the U.S. is the cleanest, dirty shirt around. There's a real sense, that this is the place that is coming up. And that is very significantly because of fossil fuels. And so what I think this president is trying to do is figure out, how can I, on the one hand, appease my environmentalists? He genuinely believes in climate change, genuinely be acting there, but allow fracking to continue. Much more fracking is happening here than in Europe, and this is under a Democratic administration. And then his big challenge, we're trying to talk about sort of looking forward, is what's going to happen on Keystone. And certainly the hope of the energy industry is that by clamping down on coal, he is buying himself a little bit of room in the fall to approve Keystone.
I'm going to move on to it. I know everybody. We could do a whole panel on this, but I want to go to audience questions, and I don't want to do it without going to foreign policy a little bit. So, EJ, I'm not going to ask you about coal, but I am going to ask you, this president basically has wound down both Iraq and Afghanistan. We're getting ready to go there. 2 wars he didn't start. Why hasn't he been able to capitalize on that and get more credit for it?
Well, I think he got some credit in being reelected president of the United States.
Fair enough.
I do think that his winning was due to a bunch of things, and we focus on the negative campaign and the problems with Mitt Romney, and all that's true enough. But I think the fact that he ended the Iraq War and clearly sent signals that his approach to foreign policy is different than President Bush's was actually, in the end, an electoral asset. Now, he's got some real problems now because he would like to move some of the focus of our foreign policy away from the Middle East and toward Asia, toward China, but also toward India and other countries around China to strengthen our alliances for the long term, I won't say struggle with China, just rivalry with China, and the Middle East keeps coming back on him. And on Syria, he's got a monstrous choice. Jeff Goldberg, who's floating around, we were talking about a week ago, he said, that's a great choice between Hezbollah and Al-Qaeda. I mean, where you're really talking on each side here.
I was going to ask that very question, and I'm going to move over to Chrystia on this, because I think everybody has some views on foreign policy. I mean, do you see Syria as an opportunity for the president or a landmine?
Landmine. And I think, the problem for this president and for America more generally is Americans clearly want to spend less money on being the world's policeman. And if you had polled the rest of the world 10 years ago, probably we would have said, yes, please, we don't want you guys to do it. We're happy to run ourselves. And I think the rest of the world has now decided, certainly, places like Canada, it's quite great to have America spend the money and be the world's policeman. And there is this, if America doesn't act, if Americans don't spend treasure and blood, then the world kind of is a mess. And the person who gets blamed the most is the U.S. president. So if you're a U.S. president who actually mostly wants to care about your domestic middle class, you run into real trouble because the world doesn't let you.
Well, Andrew actually had some thoughts about how the president sort of might move beyond sending Americans overseas. And you have made a sort of a drastic suggestion that maybe the administration might have some success in shifting defense spending into conflict avoidance. Now, I find that sounds like a pipe dream. I'm not sure that Congress would ever stand for that.
But it's not my idea. It was the Pentagon's idea, actually, several times. The Army, their quadrennial review, the Chief of Staff's advisors had a memo that came out last year called Mr. Y. Google for Mr. Y. It was an amazing memorandum on both the weakening of the country from within, economically being a big strategic risk that the Pentagon was worried about, and shifting its own strategy toward conflict aversion as opposed to being able to fight the war. I mean, you want to always be able to fight the war, but there's a lot of work within the Pentagon to do this. And you look at our responses, whether it's in Haiti or in Asia with the tsunami, the Indonesian tsunami, we built a lot of good faith and trust in the western end of Java after that terrible Indian Ocean tsunami. There was a separatist movement there that's kind of largely gone away. That is a way to fight war.
Ron, with Americans...
And again, it's not my idea.
Yeah.
I've
but
just been endorsing.
Do Americans care these days about spending money on things like that?
But it's also not new money. This would be about shifting strategies.
Right,
And
but wouldn't they say
the Pentagon,
important to something else?
$80 billion a year in research and development is done to make better weapons. The Pentagon, $80 billion. Medical research in this country is $38 billion. Energy research in this country is about $3 billion a year. So and the Pentagon is doing some of its own energy research, coming up with green fuels. So just tweaking those knobs a little bit, I think, can keep voters excited and also make a secure planet and be good for all around.
The first thing I wonder is if you Google Mr. Y, will ads for tie-dye T-shirts pop up? Look, I mean, I think that there's no question that the country believes the biggest problems we face are at home. And we've had the intervening event of 2 wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And in many ways, I think the most striking thing about Syria is how narrow is the circle of pressure on him to intervene. I mean, when Clinton talked about Bosnia and Kosovo, just think about how different this is from then, and how many voices were out there saying we cannot let this go on. But as I said, we've had kind of like major intervening events, 2 land wars in predominantly Muslim countries,
and war fatigue.
Yeah, and so I think there is really, I cannot imagine a scenario, at least I can't, where he really gets dragged. This is not something he wants to do. Syria.
I'm going in Syria.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Again, that's another thing that we could talk a lot about, but I know that, I guess now it's time to take requests for the band, essentially. So we're going to get to some questions out there, and somebody told me they've got microphones. The only problem is I can't see you all very well. Okay, there's a gentleman down here, and whoever's got...
Speak very loudly.
Great, okay. No, hold on, we've got...
there we go.
They want to have a mic for you.
I think they need the mics for recording.
If you asked me what's Obama to do from here, I would have responded to 2014 election. And I was wondering what the panel thought about the prospects for the 2014 election, what the White House and the people in Chicago who used to help him on elections can do to
In other words, if
influence-
he could change Congress, then he could go forward.
or
Good question.
just by a few votes.
Exactly.
Look, the structural 2014 elections structurally, midterm elections structurally have become tough for Democrats. The modern Democratic coalition is essentially minority voters, millennial voters, and college-educated white-collar whites, especially women. Minorities and millennials vote in much smaller numbers in off-year than midterm elections. And so as a result, it is very tough for them. The electorate is older and whiter at a time when whites maybe this room not entirely representative, over 45 are voting over 60% Republican. That is the challenge. What they're doing is a couple things. One, the agenda reflects their desire to motivate and mobilize their base. Things like immigration and gun control are part of that. And second, they're going to do all the technological wizardry that they did in the election. But if you go back and you look, the minority share of the vote has been falling off 2 or 3 points between the presidential and the midterm consistently, and the youth share of the vote falls off about 7 points at a time when they are winning 60% of voters under 30 and losing about 60% of seniors. Even small shifts in the composition make it very hard. And just one further point, red state Senate map makes it also tough in 2014.
Yeah, I agree. All the fundamentals make it difficult for Democrats, particularly gerrymandering in the House, where the Republicans control more legislatures, and the map is not great in the Senate. But what I would watch closely this year, we always pay too much attention to these other elections that happen in off years. I actually think the Virginia governor's race is going to be an important indicator of whether it'll be possible to change the turnout pattern from 2010. You have a very conservative or right-wing Republican in Mr. Cuccinelli. You've got Terry McAuliffe, who's not the most popular Democrat, but is a kind of middle-of-the-road Democrat. And if they can sort of turn the dials, to use a metaphor that's been put out there before, and increase African-American turnout some over the 2010 and 2009 turnout, if they can increase youth turnout some, then 2014 looks more promising to Democrats. Now, you should never take one state in the way I just did, but I actually think Virginia is, in many ways, a typical state for what the Democrats need to do to have any chance. Yeah, go ahead.
No, there's one more really important issue, and this is where a dial can be turned, and that's going to be how the Fed manages the taper. And that's actually, if you want to think about what's going to happen that's going to affect the next 2 years in America, who is the new chair of the Fed and how that person manages this incredibly difficult shift from pumping tons of money into the economy, that's probably the single most important question.
20-second point on that. The best thing that may have happened to Obama was that when the Fed signaled it might pull back, the market crashed. I apologize to all the people who lost money on that in the room, but I think it really sent a signal to the Fed that the markets are saying, hey, wait a minute, we need your foot on this accelerator longer than you seem to think, and certainly than the inflation hawks think.
Let's go to another question. Somebody out there? Because I have a lot more if you don't. This young lady right here.
I have a microphone. Do you want me to pass it to her, or can I ask?
I'm so sorry, I can't hear. Then we'll come down to you the next time.
Okay, I have a question about, I've listened to the entire conversation tonight, and I wanted to ask you a question about the media, because it seems from a simple logic point of view, we have a president who's doing and pushing the issues that he said he was going to push and cares about. He has a Congress that is still trying to keep him from being reelected, even though he can't be reelected. You talk about the market crash, but it all came back in the last 3 days. I mean, couldn't this be a simple situation where the media, and all of you people up there who have to come up with a new story and a new crisis and a new hot button every day, are sort of avoiding the fact that this seems like a pretty simple situation of a guy, a smart guy, trying to do the right thing in an impossible situation where, they're pretending he's running for re-election and acting that way, and things are getting better, and no one wants to admit it because in the media you're afraid of being viewed as being left-wing.
Well, okay, so...
I'm not.
So I'm perfectly happy to answer that question if you wanted to aim it at me, but I'm going to let my panelists... I mean, frankly, I feel like since I don't cover daily news anymore, that I have a little bit more of an objective view of it. People are, I think these reporters that I'm listening to are describing what's going on in Washington. And so if there's a story, for example, for today, that Congress passed the immigration bill. I'm sorry, that the Senate passed the immigration bill. They will report that the Senate passed the immigration bill, but the other part of the story, whether or not the president is doing a good job or not, is that there are going to be a lot of Republicans in the House that are going to try to keep that from being reenacted. So to suggest that the reporters are fanning the flames, I'm not sure that I would go there, because I feel like it's our job to sort of try to give viewers, even if they don't like the news, to try to let them know what's going on. So that's my point. Ron, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a columnist, so I'm an opinion writer. I'm on the liberal side of things, used to be a reporter. I'm pretty sympathetic to Obama, if you read my column, week after week. There are 2 points here. One, where I have some agreement with you is there are certain kinds of stories that probably get a lot more attention because of the nature of the news cycle than they deserve. I think the Benghazi story was essentially a ridiculous story. And that there were, not the killing of our diplomats. That was a real story, and that's what we ought to be worried about. But I think this whole business about talking points, for goodness sake, talking points by their very nature are negotiated by White House. I don't remember talking points ever being an issue in our politics.
But on the other side, EJ,
but the other side that I was going to say is, even when you're sympathetic to Obama, the guy has made mistakes. There are sometimes when I have been critical of him from the left. And so he is not a perfect president. I think he is a decent man and a decent president, and the country is better off now than it was in 2009. I believe that. But I don't think you should expect even people in the world of commentary who are sympathetic to Obama not to want to tell him or the people in the country where you think he might be making mistakes.
Any of the things that have been described as scandals have measured up with the facts as scandals after we've...
I'm sorry, but Ron wants to say, but I'm sorry, but I rarely have heard in any news media any of these things, honestly, that you've just referred to discussed as scandals. Controversy, not scandals.
We should move to the next
question.
Okay, thank you.
To some, I think the premises of the question, many of them are the kind of premises you would get in a place that is 70% one way or the other. If we were sitting here in the suburbs of Oklahoma City, someone would be asking us why we weren't exposing the Kenyan socialist who is trying to take over the American economy. The reality,
I thought you were going to say we were too left-wing.
I think the basic reality is not that Republicans are running to stop him from winning re-election. The basic reality is that House Republicans in particular, and most Senate Republicans now, as EJ said, we've had a kind of an ideological sorting out. It is a very conservative party. They don't want to do what he wants to do, and they don't believe they will pay a price for not doing it. They are wrong at the presidential level, I believe, that their blocking of this agenda will compound the problems that have caused Democrats to win the popular vote in 5 out of the past 6 elections, but they are not necessarily wrong on their own internal politics in their own districts and states, and there is very little I think the president can do that can change that. I think that if there is going to, or much less the media is going to change that. What is going to change that is kind of the tension in the Republican Party between those who believe that there has to be a repositioning to win back the White House. The Republicans, to repeat, have lost the popular vote in 5 of the past 6 presidential elections, which is the same record as Democrats had from 68 to 88 before they got Bill Clinton. So I think the idea that Republicans are doing this at a political spite, I think, is too narrow. I think they don't want to do these things, and they don't feel he can punish them for not doing them.
Well, as a science writer for 30 years who's written somewhat about politics and economics and stuff, my beef with the media, including my friends in the Washington Bureau of the New York Times, is that we cover an issue like climate change or the climate bill or the healthcare bill as a sports contest. It's about strategy, it's about who's winning, it's about who's losing. One of the most telling pieces of coverage, I thought, after the health bill was passed, was an NPR media analysis report, where the journalist reported that they did a study and showed that now everyone was, after the bill got passed, suddenly the media were reporting on what the bill means for you, as after it was passed.
But I think
because everything leading up to that was the horse race.
So I totally agree with you, Andrew, and I think The problem, and I'm very sympathetic actually with the frustration with the media, and I think there's sort of one big structural issue which is driving it, which is we are faced with a lot of very complicated issues right now. Financial reform, really complicated. Dealing with climate change, really, really complicated. Healthcare reform, really, really complicated. But the nature of the media cycle, and not just the cycle, but the technology has really empowered a sort of short attention span, ADD, horse race way of covering it. So sort of precisely at this moment when we're confronted with a lot of really complicated, multifaceted, wonkish issues, the easiest way, and look, we're all in the business. The thing that is
as a blogger,
business,
as the only blogger, are you a blogger?
I blog.
Okay, good. I mean,
I tweet.
Actually, blogs go deep. Blogs go deeper than daily coverage because they're not distilling everything down to a sound
The
bite.
long tail of blogs does.
Every blog I read
I'm
is a run-on
going to
sentence
move
of
back to
coverage.
another question, just so we can move back to the presidential agenda as opposed to this young lady was, and it's okay. I'm so old I can call you a young lady, right? You're not offended by that.
I wanted to first thank you for calling me that.
Okay.
So what comes to mind is that in the aftermath of 9/11, President Bush had an opportunity to call on us to do something, national service, or in some way come together, and kind of blew it. And I'm wondering what opportunity may be missed now that President Obama has that would unify us.
That's
Preach,
a great
sister.
question.
I mean, there are two things I wish President Obama had done that he didn't do. One was, I think that liberal or progressive presidents, and liberals and progressive generally, have more of an obligation to both reform government and to be visible trying to reform it than anybody else. Because we're the people who say, we believe government can do good things, we believe it can work, and I wish he had done a more aggressive effort on government hiring and all the rest. And that relates to the second, which is with the enormous young constituency he had the capacity to call young people to public service. One of the best speeches, one of my favorite speeches at any political convention was when Carolyn Kennedy Schlossberg spoke, I think it was the 88 convention, I think it was 88, where she said one of the best things in her life are all the people she met over the years who came up to her to say, I served in government, or I did some time in public service because your father asked me to serve. And I would really like to see Obama close with that. We just had the Franklin Project meeting here at Aspen, which I was part of, and I'm very sympathetic to that. I think it would fit very well with Obama's own philosophy and what he said he wants to do. And I'd like him to do both of those things.
I wanted to go up there because we're favoring this side of the audience. So the gentleman up there with his hand, do you see him in the blue shirt?
Thank you. Ron, I just want to follow up on your point, if I may. I'm having a difficult time really understanding the Republican strategy because...
So are they, I think.
If you accept the possibility that Hillary Clinton runs, you have to believe that they believe she's going to be an overwhelming favorite to win. So they could be facing 11 and a half years without the White House. So I'm having a difficult time figuring out how the Karl Rose of this day are devising a strategy that is going to go forward, because they could be looking at 11 and a half years without the White House.
So Mike Gerson, who may be in the crowd here, who was George Bush's speechwriter and now at the One campaign, founded by Bono, a great writer and thinker, put it very well.
And a columnist for the Washington Post.
Put it very well at an event this morning. I mean, the Republican Party is divided between those who believe the answer is to mobilize their coalition and those who think you must modify their coalition. I mean, as I said, the fundamental reality they face is that Mitt Romney ran as well among white voters as any Republican challenger ever in the history of polling, including Eisenhower in 52, Bush in 88, and better than Reagan in 1980, and Barack Obama won 332 electoral college votes. If Barack Obama won only 38% of non-college white women and only 46% of college white women, does anybody think that Hillary Clinton would not at least have a shot at doing better? So what that does is, I mean, by logic, that says there is no way back to the White House without improving your performance among minority voters in particular. The problem is that in order to do that, you have to do a certain number of things that the party, much of the party doesn't want to do, which the House Republicans don't want to do. So now there is this counter view developing, which is, no, we don't really have to improve among minorities. By the way, if Democratic vote, Barack Obama won 80% of minorities, which is basically what Democrats have been winning since 1976. If the Democratic nominee wins 80% of minority voters in 2016, they can win a national majority with only 37% of whites, okay? Which is an incredibly low number. But the problem is that to improve, as I said, they have to do some things they don't want to do. So you have this counter view now developing around the House Republicans. No, the problem is we've got to get our base out more. And so that is it, modify or mobilize.
And they had, two things. One is they did have a base problem. I mean, there were about 5 million missing voters, or a lot of white working class voters missing who just sat out this election. So they actually, in a way, have to both modify and mobilize. But here's the problem they've got. Our friend and colleague, Ron and I, Dan Baltz, wrote what I still think is one of the most important news stories about an election after the 96 election. And it was about the suburban collar counties around places like Philadelphia. It's about probably one of the best examples, Montgomery County and places like that. Those used to be bastions for Republicans like George H.W. Bush, John Hines. They'd vote really strongly Republican. In the 90s, when Bill Clinton ran, a lot of those Republicans started defecting in big numbers. And they not only defected from their votes, they defected from the party altogether and stopped voting in Republican primaries. Why did Christine, I am not a witch, O'Donnell, defeat Mike Castle, one of the most respected Republicans in the House? It was because he was a moderate, and all of Mike Castle's voters had left the Republican Party. And so it's a real problem. The wife of a friend of mine who's broadly progressive has been saying maybe we should re-register as Republicans so we can help them make their party a little more moderate. But I think it's a real problem that they have.
Listen, I'm going to get back because we're almost out of time, and I think there is really a band coming to play here in a few minutes.
Actually, all these people are here for the band.
No, I think they're all staying to see what we would look like dancing. That's what they really want to see. So I'm going to close by just very briefly asking each one of you if you could give the president one piece of advice that could help him further his administration, what would it be? And Andrew, I'll start with you. And again, because we're running out of time, I'm going to ask everybody to be fairly brief with these.
Setting aside climate and going for the energy initiatives and resilience initiatives that are no-brainers, that again, many libertarians and liberals will agree on. There's plenty to do, but he has to get out of the White House to do it.
I would say, even with limited expectation of success, you can never give up on the ideal of being president of the whole country, and you constantly have to try to talk to people who do not intrinsically agree with you.
I'm going to go to EJ because I really believe a woman should get the last word here. So.
Schmooze more, even if it doesn't work, to call the country to service and lay out an agenda for greater equality and social mobility, even if it doesn't pass as a flag for people to repair to over the next decade.
Chrystia.
Yes, I'm going to double down on EJ's last point. The biggest challenge of the 21st century is that the middle class is getting squeezed. And even as the economy recovers, I think that's going to continue because it's really driven by fundamental things like the technology revolution and globalization. And the president thinks that too. You know, some of his top advisors are the economists working on these issues. I think he really, going back to the bully pulpit, he should give up on using it to get Congress to vote in a particular way. And his sort of last 2 years should be about laying out actually a global agenda that says, these are the things we have to do in the Western industrialized democracies to make the economy work for the middle class.
Well, thank you all. Great panel and a great audience. Appreciate it.